Hello and welcome to Troubleshooting Zen Study and Practice number 39. And today our question is, can you say something more about Zen Buddhism and the archetypes of the collective unconscious? Those of you who have listened to previous Troubleshooting Zen Study and Practice may have heard me talking about the archetype of the shadow, and in fact there's a whole episode Troubleshooting Zen Study and Practice number 34 which does actually cover this. But this question broadens it out a little bit more to want to look at what are called the archetypes of the collective unconscious, of which the shadow is one, in more general terms. So just to remind ourselves, the archetypes of the collective unconscious is a term or terms that were coined by the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung, and I think partially because he certainly obviously had an interest in Eastern religions, and he in fact also wrote an introduction to one of Daisetsu Suzuki's books on Zen Buddhism as well. So he certainly had an interest in Eastern religions himself, but he was very much a medic, a doctor, and one of the early depth psychologists. He was a student of Sigmund Freud, but they had a split early on in the 20th century, and Jung went on to develop his own psychology called analytical psychology. So I want to keep this sort of reasonably focused on Zen training and what we can expect, because that's obviously the subject of our discussions here in this particular series. But it's probably just sort of fair enough I will need to just explain a few of the basic terms that Jung coined. So Jung said basically that after the early part of life, when human beings enter the second part of life, once they've, as it were, got a certain amount of their early baggage, emotional baggage, to coin the term, sorted out, then that the role of the second part of life was to prepare oneself for death. But even above and beyond that, it was also about coming to terms with really what the ground of our own being is, and as it were, developing a relationship with that grounded being. And this was a process that he termed individuation, which is where the person is able to turn inwards and reconnect with psyche at its deepest level, and basically the psyche itself was seen as being sort of stratified at if you imagine it's like the ocean. If you go out into the middle of the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean, on the top you've got the waves rising up and down as the wind blows on them, and the currents swirl through them as well. Those things are close to the surface, they're quite rapid, and this he likened to our waking consciousness, which is full of activity inwardly and outwardly. But as you sink deeper into the ocean, it actually you come across the deeper currents that might be invisible from the surface, but they're still highly influential. But as one goes deeper and deeper and eventually comes right to the bottom, there's a sort of stillness there. And he said that human consciousness, evolutionary, but also human consciousness, was very much like this, that there's a thin layer of waking consciousness on the top, there's an interface, and then there is the depths, as it were, and this is the unconscious. And Jung mapped that unconscious, or he had a map of the unconscious. Part of that unconscious was personal. This is where one's own complexes and traumas and memories and so forth, and personal affects, the emotions, are stored, so to speak. A lot of that being covered obviously by Freud. But he said there was a deeper element to it. There was a doorway and then a deeper element to what he called the collective unconscious. And this is he changed the definition of the collective unconscious over time, but suffice to say it's a shared unconsciousness which we share with humanity, and at the deepest level with everything. In fact, he said at the deepest level that the unconscious and the physical world are also conjoined as well, which is interesting because that's certainly something that's very much reflected. Those of you who are familiar with the teachings of the Yogacara and the eight consciousnesses of the Yogacara, the Alaya Vijnana, the storehouse consciousness, will know that there's something very similar in those teachings as well, this touching of the physical and the mental. And certainly in the whole of Buddhism, there's no separation between the physical and the mental. It's all one system, if you like, or one. Well, it's all one. It's not two, shall we say. So these collective unconscious and also the personal unconscious, he said, were ruled by what he called archetypes. And an archetype, rather like we use the word architect, it's a structural word. It's a word that refers to the way that consciousness structures the experience of reality. Jung likened it, he said that what the archetypes do is that they guide and structure perception, how we perceive the world, and that these archetypes can influence us both unconsciously. You can't actually see the archetypes, he says, but the archetypes will wear images or symbols. And he identified a number of different archetypes. But as far as the individuation process was concerned, there were three archetypes that were particularly important to this process of individuation, which is a process which is very similar to a spiritual path, really, and that's perhaps why we're talking about this, why it's of interest to us. So there were three archetypes that were particularly important. The first was the archetype that was called the shadow, and as I say, if you listen to Troubleshooting Zen Study and Practice episode 34, there's a whole episode on that. And the shadow has a personal side, and basically the elements of the shadow are made up of all those things that consciousness seeks to repress about itself. It's all those sort of nasty, ugly things that I prefer not to think about myself. I always remember a friend of mine who's who's been in the Zen training for about 18 months was talking to me and laughed at one point and said, I always regarded myself as a very sort of open-minded, sort of liberal sort of person. He said, but I've come to realize over the past few months that actually I am quite a bigot in my own way. If I meet someone who doesn't share my views, I tend to think quite badly of them quite quickly without necessarily, opening up and seeing things, putting myself in their shoes, for example. He said, I never realized that before. Now that's a classic shadow element coming into consciousness, where he had this view of himself as being one thing, and then through the increasing awareness, by becoming more mindful or becoming more aware generally, one begins to notice these elements. And it's an interesting thing, because we talk about awareness and mindfulness and being more mindful and more aware, and people think, oh yes, it's a lovely thing to be more aware. Yes, it is, but the process of becoming aware is extremely painful, because one is cut down several pegs, or two or three or four, by this process of becoming more aware, because one becomes more aware of the contents of one's own heart, and one sees that, how small, how miserly, how bigoted, how one-sided, how selfish, how me first and me only I can be as well. And all that's part of the personal shadow. And Jung also said that there was that the shadow had a dual element, because there was another aspect of the shadow that was from the collective, and anything that's in the collective is magnified because of the mass of humanity, if you like. And so anything that appears to us as satanic that is the other side of the mass movements. So, obviously think of like Nazism or something like that. The horrors that ordinary people can perpetrate often come through from the collective into the personal shadow, if one's own personal shadow is if we're unaware of it. In other words, the personal shadow contains the fears, my personal fears, and the collective can play on those personal fears in order to cause ordinary people to do extraordinary, terrible things. This was Jung's explanation. And so he said that in order to close the door of the shadow to the collective shadow so that one isn't overwhelmed by it, the best defense is to make one's own personal shadow conscious. And of course, this is very much part of the insight practice that we do. When we are sitting in meditation, when we go on retreats, when we're undertaking daily life practice, and we begin to have these sorts of realizations about myself. That it's things can be very uncomfortable. And I remember again from my own training, one of the things, as you will know, one of the things that we are recommended to do is to set up a simple timetable. Time to get up in the morning, a time to go to bed at night, meals, zazen, just something simple like that. So dutifully did that, set up my timetable. But the thing was that I was in the habit, or I've been in the habit, of when the alarm went off in the morning, listening to the news for 10 minutes and then getting out of bed. And I really enjoyed that. It sort of gave me time to wake up and sort of, get ready for the day. But the timetable said, no, as soon as the alarm goes off, get out of bed. So I thought, okay, well, that's what I have to do. But the problem was, it was the actual doing of it. The alarm would go off in the morning, and I would just turn and I would hit the radio button, and I would lie there for 10 minutes. And whilst I was listening to the news headlines, there would be this conversation going on in my head saying, but you're supposed to get up. And the other side saying, well, I don't want to. I want to listen to the news. Well, this is what the training is about. Well, this Japanese thing, they're always, used to obedience, etc. But I can make my own mind up. Well, you did make your own mind up. You said you wanted to do the Zen training, and this part is part of it. Now get on with it. No, and the rest of it. And so the 10 minutes would be ruined anyway. But it was really aggravating. I found it was impossible. It was impossible. And I would go to bed the night before, and I would vow to myself, when the alarm goes off, I will get up in the morning as soon as the alarm goes off. And the alarm would go off, and I would just switch the radio on again. And I became more and more exasperated. And then after a while, I actually became a little bit frightened. And I thought, my God, what is happening to me? And then it was at some point after that I had this dawning realization that the person who went to bed at night was not the same person who was waking up in the morning. And that really undermined that feeling of I as a sort of continuous self who goes to sleep at night and then wakes up in the morning. And suddenly looking at the six realms, or the six states on the wheel of life, and recognizing those six different types of being that float up and float down, and that one can be reborn moment to moment and day by day in any of those six realms. Suddenly the deeper meaning of that wonderful symbol on the wheel of life truly began to sink in and make sense. And that was a moment of shadow. That was a moment when that vanity that I am in charge of the whole thing, or that even that I am the same person from day to day, fell away. So the shadow is the first archetype that's encountered in Jung's schemata of things. But the second one is known as the animus, or the anima. And animus or anima often refers to, the term itself, animus, is often used to refer to an emotional state of high agitation, usually quite angry. If somebody has a lot of animus, then they have a lot of emotional, usually aggressive or angry energy about them. Animus is the male, and anima is the female. And in Jung's system of the psyche, this is known as the contrasexual archetype. So obviously Jung, was working on the binary of male and female. So for a conscious male, the unconscious contrasexual will be the anima, the female. It's the female part of the soul. And for the conscious female, it is the animus, is the unconscious male aspect. So, but basically, what this refers to, if you think, for example, that male and female is a classic pair of opposites, they're seen as standing in contradistinction and opposite each other as a complementary pair, then that gives a flavour of what this archetype is about. The archetype of the anima animus is the archetype of what is other to myself. And in a way, obviously, so is the shadow in its own way. But this is at a much deeper level, and it is as a much spiritual level as well. And the important thing to say is that Jung regarded the anima, or the animus, as the gateway from the personal to the collective unconscious. And that all the collective archetypes pass through the anima animus. So the second archetype that's encountered after the shadow has been reasonably integrated is this contrasexual archetype, the anima and the animus. And really this is about this is not and Jung said that this not only guides the anima animus, it guides our ability to relate to what is other than myself. So he said it's obviously very important in our personal relationships, and certainly in our intimate and sexual and loving relationships as well. The person who we live with, or the person that we're married to, for example, often catches the projection of that other. Which is why the often with couples you often find them being can quite often be totally opposite. One will be introvert, one will be extrovert, one will be very practical, the other one might be very cerebral, whatever. But often there's a sort of complementariness about couples, and that complementariness signifies the relationship between the anima and consciousness, or the animus and consciousness, waking consciousness as well. And so it's about that presence, but also recognizing that the other is the carrier of what is truly mysterious as well. So it has a spiritual bent. And I remember Master Daiyu used to tell a nice story from that was originally told, I think, by Sir Lawrence van der Post, and it was a story from the Bushman, the Kalahari. And the story goes that there was the Bushman, so this particular Bushman, he was a cowherd, and he discovered that his cows were dry of milk. And he wondered somebody must be coming along and stealing the milk during the night. So he made watch, and in the middle of the night he saw these ladders coming down from heaven, and these heavenly maidens coming down the ladders with pails, and they were milking the cows. And suddenly he jumped up and said, "Oi, hey, stop, thief!" And they all saw him and ran. The heavenly maidens ran to the ladder, and they climbed up the ladders. And the ladders were pulled up to heaven. But there was one of the heavenly maidens who was a little bit too far away, and she couldn't make it back in time, and he managed to catch her. And as they do in the folk tales and fairy tales, they took one look at each other and they fell in love with each other, and he said, "Be my wife," and she said, "Yes, gladly, and I will bring you great happiness." And they set up house together. And she brought with her her pail, which was actually her milk pail, which was actually a gourd, a hollowed out gourd with a lid that sat on top of it. That's used for carrying all sorts of things. In this case, it was for the milk from the cows. And she said, "This is my little calabash." She said to him, and one thing she said is that you must never ever look inside the calabash, otherwise our happiness will come to an end. So he said yes, of course, and they settled down and lived together, and they had the children and so forth. But the one forbidden thing, you're not allowed to do this, and it sort of begins to gnaw away at you, and this is what happened with him. And one day while she was out, he couldn't resist it anymore. He went over to the calabash, lifted off the lid, looked inside, nothing. And he burst out laughing. And when she came back, he was still laughing, and she knew exactly why he was laughing. And she said to him, "You fool, you fool, I told you not to look inside that calabash. Now you have allowed our happiness to escape." And she picked up the calabash and with the children, and she left and was never seen again. It's a classic fairy tale motif. He thinks she is ridiculous because she was making such a thing about the calabash, which in the end was empty. That's what he saw, that it was just empty. But actually, what he didn't recognize was the mystery of the other. And that's what was inside that calabash, until the moment he took the top off and looked inside, and then he destroyed that mystery, and so obviously she couldn't stay, and that was why she actually had to leave. So it's about being able to tolerate that presence of the other within us, and this refers very much to what is known in Buddhism as the Buddha nature. We talk about the Buddha nature, but the Buddha nature is that which is other inside us as well. To every eye, no eye is other, or shunyata is other, and shunyata is the true nature, or the true nature of the Buddha nature. And this is once we become aware that the Buddha nature is operating within us, we can never know anything about it because it is pure mystery. However, we learn to live in its presence. And having, as it were, integrated the anima animus, this otherness within us, then we come through to the totalizing, or the grand archetype, which is the archetype of the self with a capital S. This isn't I, this is the capital S self. And this is, if you like, this is the archetype of the integrated whole. And this is where consciousness, the conscious person, and the other, represented by the anima animus, have become fully integrated and now operate as a whole. It's sometimes known as the divine or perfect marriage, but it's the inner marriage, where the individual expresses the deepest mystery of the Buddha nature itself. And there's a nice, just to finish off, there's a nice story from the Hindu god Agni, who's the god of fire, and Agni was with the god of the winds, and they were talking with each other, two male gods. And whilst they were talking, they saw a mysterious cloud floating towards them. And Agni said to the wind god, he said, "Go over and see what that cloud is." So the wind god goes over and says to the cloud, "Who are you?" And the cloud says to the wind god, "And who are you?" And the wind god says, "I am the god of the winds." And out of the cloud floats a little feather. And he said, "Well, if you're god of the winds, blow that feather away." "What? Of course, that's nothing." And he blew one of his high winds, but the feather didn't move at all. So he blew again, one of his stronger winds. Nothing at all. And then he blew this hurricane at it. It didn't even shiver. And the cloud laughed at him and said, "Well, you're not much up to good if you can't even blow that feather away." And humiliated, the wind god goes back to Agni and told him what had happened. And Agni said, "Why, go and sort that cloud out." Goes over and says, "I am Agni, Lord, god of fire." He said, "Who are you?" And he said, "Well, if you're Agni, god of fire," he said, "why don't you burn this up?" And he out from the cloud comes a little piece of straw, and Agni, of course, blasts it with all his fire, but nothing. And blasts it with all his fire again. 3 times he blasted it, not even singed. and Agni goes back, and now the fire god and the wind god are frightened because what is this great power? And at that moment, a goddess comes past, and they say, "Terror, be careful, be careful." And she says, "Do you not know what that cloud is?" And they said, "No." He said, "That is the cloud of mystery. That is the cloud that is the basis of all our beings, all as gods and goddesses. We come from that cloud, and that is where we will go as well. That is why you cannot penetrate it. That is why you have no power against such a thing." And this gives that real sense of that something's profound and incredibly deep that exists in the heart of all. But at the end of the day is a complete mystery. And yet, even though it cannot be known as such, we can live with the presence of that mystery and in relationship to that mystery. It's something that is felt, that moves through, and that our training actually is opening us finally to that deep and profound awareness to the nature of things as they really are, which is what that self, of course, symbolizes. So there we go. We'll leave that there. That's talking a little bit about the archetypes of the unconscious. Obviously, it's a very involved, and there were many other archetypes as well that Jung identified, and those that came after Jung have also done the same. But don't particularly want to go down that too much, but hopefully that gives a little bit of a complementary to see how that spiritual process of awakening to one's true nature is a staged process, which is certainly a view that is very much shared by Buddhism and also by the Zen school. Just to remind you, if you want to ask a question for the troubleshooting series, then email your question to rinzai@thezengateway.com. That's Rinzai, RINZAI, at thezengateway.com, and do my best to provide an answer. Thank you very much. Till the next time.